Hi everybody and welcome back to the course. In this last lecture, it's going to be a little bit different than the previous four, insofar as that we're actually looking forward. We're looking rather than back to the 13th century, to the origins of the Franciscan vision of creation. We're going to take a look at what is being done today by some theologians in the Franciscan tradition in terms of advancing this Franciscan global vision for the 20th and 21st centuries moving forward. And so in that regard, it's a little bit different. It's a little bit different than what we've seen so far. And I should state, just to make it clear, that these are examples. This is not the only the only work that's being done, I guess I could say. But rather this is illustrative, and I've chosen three sort of diverse examples to highlight precisely what I mean by this. So the aim here is picking up with this notion of Laudato Si as a starting point rather than an end, a beginning rather than the final word. And so where do we go within this Franciscan global vision moving forward? What are Franciscan thinkers, theologians doing today to move beyond Laudato Si, not in the sense that Laudato Si is problematic and should be forgotten, but how does one build on it? Much like in the 13th century, you had academics like Bonaventure and John Duns Scotus building on the vernacular theology and mystical intuition of somebody like Francis of Assisi. You saw that as well play out in terms of the experience of Christian mysticism represented in the writings of Angela Foligno, or in the kind of ethical reflection that we see presented in the usus pauper doctrine as argued by Peter of John Olivi. So today we're going to jump ahead a few centuries to the 20th and 21st. And in three areas, three contemporary approaches I want to touch on. The first is ecology and liberation, arising from the second half of the 20th century, in particular the South American context within Latin American liberation theology. There's this attentiveness to what the contributor we'll look at in a moment, the former Franciscan friar Leonardo Boff calls the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, a theme again that Pope Francis himself draws from and engages. Next, we're going to look at decolonial eco-spirituality, and here I'm going to point to some examples of my own work, not because it's necessarily the best or at all the final word, but because, well, A, I'm very familiar with it, and B, I think it provides yet another example of the kind of Franciscan constructive work being done today in contribution to the Franciscan global vision. So I'd like to share with you some of the conversation topics, some of the work that's being done in that area. And then finally, really quite revolutionary and cutting edge work done within the Franciscan tradition with regard to evolution and posthumanism. And here we're going to take a look at the work of Sister Ilia Delio, who is really on the forefront of the relationship between science and theology, particularly as a Franciscan and what the Franciscan tradition offers by way of foundation and inspiration for the kind of work that she's engaging with today. So without further ado, let's start with Leonardo Boff. He was born in 1938. He's from Brazil. He was a former Franciscan friar. He entered the Franciscan order in 1964, was subsequently ordained, and in 1992 he left religious life, but continues to work among communities of the marginalized and the vulnerable, particularly within the Brazilian context, and his work does focus on Latin American liberation theology. That is the operative hermeneutic. But as a Franciscan, once a Franciscan friar and now a Franciscan-hearted theologian who continues to carry forward the Franciscan tradition, he's engaging with these pressing concerns of the ecological crises before us through a particular lens. Again, and this is the primary aim of this week's course is to think about what does a lens look like that is distinctively Franciscan as it pertains to creation and eco-spirituality. Boff is largely recognized as one of the first Latin American liberation theologians and one of the first theologians in his context to connect liberation of oppressed members of the human family with ecology as such, or reflection on, engagement with, discussion about what Pope Francis will call our common home. And he's also a major contributor to the now famous Earth Charter, which was promulgated in the year 2000, an ecumenical, interreligious, document. In addition to all of this, he's the author of more than 80 books, very prolific, that have been translated into numerous languages, many of which are available still in print in English. He centers his ecological theology on the key Christian doctrines of incarnation and Trinity. So we'll see that over and over again in his work. Obviously, we don't have time to go into it in any great depths this week, but as you consult the bibliography for the course and do your own sort of investigation, you'll see how these kinds of themes return and surface again and again in his writing and in his scholarship. And these are both central themes, theological doctrines, in the Franciscan tradition that go back, as we saw earlier this week, to St. Francis of Assisi himself. His own understanding of the community of creation, God's community of creation, is rooted in, of course, the incarnation, this idea that God enters the world, becomes part of creation, joins with us in it. So Boff carries that tradition forward into the 20th century and up through today. I mentioned this already, centrality of the incarnation and Trinity. The other thing that's present throughout all of his work, particularly on theology of creation, is this inherent interrelationship of all creation. And this is what leads, of course, to the connection that he recognizes existing between the cry of the earth, that is, the degradation, the harm, the transgression that is caused to the more than human world, we might say, and the way that we relate to one another within the human society, right? So the way we treat the human poor. Pope Francis will pick this language up again in Laudato Si. He'll use this as a paradigm to encourage what he'll call, as we discovered on the first day of this week, the integral ecological framework, right? So integral ecology. It's worth just taking a look at a couple excerpts of some of Boff's writing. He says in one notable passage, it's rather lengthy here in 2 slides, ecology has to do with relations, interactions, and dialogue of all living creatures, whether alive or not, among themselves and with all that exists. This includes not only, quote, nature, what he calls natural ecology, but culture and society, which we might call human ecology, social ecology, and so on. From an ecological viewpoint, everything that exists coexists. So, integral ecology, you can see the seeds of that play out here that become more and more overt in the Church's magisterial teaching with Laudato Si, right? Coexistence, existence being interrelated here, right? Everything is connected, integral ecology. And he says, and everything that coexists and pre-exists subsists by means of an infinite web of all-inclusive relations. Nothing exists outside relationships. Isn't that telling, right? Hopefully this harkens for you back to Francis of Assisi's own journey of ongoing conversion that's deeply situated within the realization, the ever-growing realization that Christian discipleship is centered on relationship. That the purpose of the incarnation, of course, is God's entrance into the world as part of the world to enter most fully into relationship with humanity and all creation. Boff continues, he says, ecology reaffirms the interdependence of beings, interprets all hierarchies as a matter of function, and repudiates the so-called right of the strongest. All creatures manifest and possess their own reflective autonomy. Nothing is superfluous or marginal. So again, going back to the core, to Francis of Assisi, what do we see here? We see the inherent dignity and value of all creatures. Nothing is marginal. Nothing is sort of optional or an accessory to the main event, which in an anthropocentric paradigm situates humanity, human beings at the center of the cosmos. Like Francis of Assisi, that recognized this inherent not only dignity and value, but a gentle capacity of all creatures, that they can engage in the world, relate to their creator, praise God, connect with other creatures in this cosmic web of creation. He closes this passage of his book Ecology and Liberation by saying, as Christians, we may say that it comes from God and returns to God, this vast cosmic chain. Here, again, he's drawing from not only the Franciscan influence, but deeply scriptural influences, such as what we read in Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 8, that famously that line says that all of creation is yearning, is longing, is groaning for this day of salvation, right? But we also see this model of exitus and reditus, the coming from and returning back to God, which is a scholastic paradigm that people like Bonaventure frame their theological reflection with. In addition, we see this again in the early church. Since we started really in the 13th century in this week's material, we didn't talk about sacred scripture all that much or about the first theologians, and here I'm thinking in particular of Irenaeus of Lyon, who has a very strong sense of salvation as a two-sided coin that involves creation and salvation, that when God creates, God also intends to bring all of creation back to God's self, or what St. Paul will call recapitulation. And so we see here Boff emphasizing that point, reiterating that point. Everything that God creates, as Bonaventure would say, from the single divine source, emanates, comes from God, and it's God's plan of salvation to bring everything back to God's self. In his book, Cry of Earth, Cry of Poor, he says, liberation theology and ecological discourse have something in common. They start from two bleeding wounds. The wound of poverty breaks the social fabric of missions and millions of poor people around the world. The other wound, systemic assault on the earth, breaks down the balance of the planet, which is under threat from the plundering of development as practiced by contemporary global societies. And so here we see, this book came out in the early 1990s, and we can see how these insights from the Franciscan tradition kind of trickle up, as it were, and influence not only the thinking of Pope Francis, but also the Church's official teaching in Laudato Si. It's really important for us to pause and reflect on, what are the implications of this kind of work. And Boff's major thesis, if I can distill it to this in an overly simplified form, it's that there is no liberation, there is no experience of God's freedom and mercy and love and justice for the human family as long as there's no freedom and liberation for the non-human family as well, and vice versa. That these things, because we are part of one community of creation, these are concerns that affect, both, I was almost going to say demographics, but that's a very anthropocentric way of talking about it, but both constituencies, both communities within the broader family of creation. Maybe that's a better way to talk about it. Let me just say a little bit about decolonial eco-spirituality. Some of the work that I have been centering my research on of late is precisely the same sort of trajectory that we saw in the 13th century, returning back to the sources, going back to Francis, going back to Bonaventure, to Scotus, to Olivi, to Angelo Foligno, and others. While liberation is presumed as part of this, I'm very interested personally in what the Franciscan tradition has to say in advancing what I think is a very important statement in Laudato Si. Again, a liminal text. So how do we pull it forward? How do we move beyond Laudato Si? And there are a couple things that I've centered on, and I'm not alone. Again, I want to make this clear. Just like Boff is not alone as a Latin American liberation theologian, I'm not alone in this kind of constructive theology of creation and eco-spirituality. Nor is Professor Delio alone in her own work with transhumanism and posthumanism. But the three of us reflect a contemporary, or samples or examples of contemporary Franciscan engagement with some of these some of these thoughts, some of these thinkers, some of these ideas. So as I mentioned, my starting point is a ressourcement of the Franciscan tradition, going back not just to the Canticle of the Creatures, as important as it is, but looking at a whole array of oftentimes underutilized sources. So the bulk of this week has been an exploration of the historical sources in the Franciscan tradition, many of which even a fair amount of Franciscans are themselves unfamiliar. Take Angela Foligno and her writings, for instance, or take Peter of John Olivi and his writings. I dare say that there are quite a number of Franciscans of all branches that have not really read much of Bonaventure or Scotus, for that matter. So how is it that we can look at the signs of our times, see the world as it is, recognize the ecological crises that face us, and where do we seek resources? Well, let's go back to the roots of our tradition. Let's go back to these underutilized sources. that's one step. The second step then is engaging with critical thinking today. And so here I'm particularly drawn to and have done a lot of work on post-colonial and decolonial theory or hermeneutics. From post-coloniality, I've been interested in this concept that's put forward by Gayatri Spivak, a post-colonial theorist who teaches at Columbia University. And she kind of coined this phrase about 15 years ago or so called planetarity. And it was really a critical response to the notion of globalization and this idea that, you know, globalization and the way that market systems and capital works is to kind of chop up and organize the world, you know, in the same way that we saw, for instance, after World War II or in the colonial periods of the, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th centuries. Planetarity is taking a further step back. And I'm, again, oversimplifying here, but it's this idea of what is our starting point for, or reference point for thinking about reality as it is. And in some, Spivak says, you know, planetarity is thinking about this kind of collective whole, that we are part of one family of creation, one world, one planet. In many ways, that kind of thinking reminds me of what various astronauts have said when they've returned from space visits and talk about being in orbit and looking down on the planet, looking down on Earth, and recognizing that, you know, the truth of the matter, of the fiction of nation states and of boundaries and of borders and these kinds of things that seemingly divide us as such urgent and real concerns, when in fact, when you look from a cosmic perspective, as it were, our interrelatedness, our unity, our singular connection is what is most evident. More recently, in addition to post-colonial theory, which finds its origins in places, certain places in the global south, I think of the subcontinent of India, where a lot of post-colonial thinkers have really emerged. Decoloniality is a related but different hermeneutical approach, different mode of critical thinking. And decoloniality really finds its kind of energy and its emergence in South America with a number of Latin American thinkers. And the idea is, you know, looking at what I'll call subjugated epistemologies, you know, suppressed ways of thinking or knowing, cultures, perspectives, ways of being in the world, ways of engaging and relating that have been dismissed or devalued. How do we think differently, you know, not just kind of out of the box in a corporate sense, but recognize that there is a plurality, there's a diversity, there's a multiplicity of ways of being and thinking and cultures that exist, and not succumb to the kind of hegemony that is part and parcel of, you know, kind of late modern capitalism. What does this mean for us? Well, in my own work, this has involved decentering the human person, and to think about the way that we evaluate all of creation and other creatures according to our own experience and categories. So when we talk about, you know, rationality is what distinguishes us, it's a concept of rationality that's aligned with the one who is making that kind of claim. So whether you're Martin Heidegger in the early 20th century, or whether you're somebody today that talks about, you know, human beings and reason and rationality, it's a reflection more of our experience than it is anything else. So if we think about the role of agency, the role of reason, the role of relational capacity, etc., in the world, is it limited to human persons as such? Or can non-human creatures also, in their own kind of contextual and respective way, exhibit a form of these sort of modalities, these sort of characteristics that we otherwise ascribe solely to the human species? I've also, you know, this has led to development of and an argument for a richer development of the theology of imagination and a retrieval of pneumatology. I believe very strongly that the inability for us to think imaginatively and to think about what imagining looks like as a human faculty has stymied our ability to recognize some of these truths that surface when we engage in this kind of decolonial eco-spirituality. And also the role of pneumatology. The Holy Spirit has been sort of a forgotten third wheel of the Holy Trinity. And the fact that the Spirit plays such a central role in the classic Christian doctrines of creation, such as creatio ex nihilo, creatio continua, as we talked about earlier, and so forth, I think the fact that we have an underdeveloped pneumatology is a real problem. And the Franciscan tradition offers resources as well to draw from. Finally, on this point, in terms of sources, engagement with natural science, evolutionary biology, ethology, which is the study of non-human animal behavior, as well as contemporary philosophy. I'm fascinated by philosophy of science and the work of biological semiotics, and helping us to rethink presumptions that are generally operative among humans about the more than human world. And so key themes keep emerging in this work, and just to highlight a few, for instance, the evaluation of anthropocentrism in classical Christian doctrines. Is there another way, an orthodox way within the Christian tradition, drawing from our resources, especially the Franciscan resources, to think about the meaning of something like the image of God? When we say human beings are created imago Dei, is that an exclusive statement, or is that a distinctive statement? If it's exclusive, then it says that human beings are unique within creation because only we exhibit this concept of imago Dei. Or is it more capacious? Are there different ways of imaging God, right? Recognition of non-human creaturely agency. This follows from a decolonial sort of hermeneutic. If I determine that rationality looks like what I experience it as, then anything that doesn't parallel that or match or rise to that bar will be considered irrational or irrational. So what does it mean to talk about creatures that have meaning making, that are, not merely fleshy machines, as René Descartes in the 17th century referred to them? Again, drawing from the Franciscan tradition, asserting particularity as a starting point. So emphasizing hakcheitas, as we've looked at with John Duns Scotus. Also thinking about alterity. Who determines othering? Who determines the categorizations that form not only our social fabric, but the understanding of the broader community of creation? I would argue with the Franciscan tradition for what we might call a theocentric alterity or theocentric othering. There's, as I mentioned in a previous lecture, there are two categories. There's God and not God. We, like Bonaventure says, are on the not God side of the equation. Therefore, God is the one who establishes alterity. It's creatures and the Creator. What are the implications for how we live our life, how we structure our society, how we understand ethical norms in light of those insights? Again, affirmation of inherent interrelatedness in the entire community of creation, a theme that is so deeply Franciscan that it's unavoidably present, not only in the three examples I'm posing here by way of conclusion this week, but something we've seen at every step of our engagement with material this week. And finally, acknowledgement of non-human creation as subaltern and victim of colonial logic. This is where post-colonial and decolonial theory is particularly useful. It gives us language, frameworks, ways of thinking about humanity's relationship to the more than human world by drawing from the insights of the way we've related internally within the human community or within human society. And so here we can, there's a parallel, there's a connection, there's an overlap, as it were, with Leonardo Boff's notion of ecological liberation, right? So he wants to point out, right, the inseparability of the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. Likewise, can we think about, can we imagine non-human creation, the planet, earth, other creatures, for instance, as those who are themselves victims of human colonization, right, and abuse. Finally, I want to talk about evolution and posthumanism. Sister Ilia Delio, a professor of theology at Villanova University, this is really on the cutting edge, the leading edge of where Franciscans are engaging this global vision of creation today. She is a professor, as I mentioned, at Villanova University. She's originally from the state of New Jersey in the United States, and was trained first as a scientist. She actually has earned 2 doctorates, one in pharmacology from Rutgers University, and the second in historical theology from the Jesuit Fordham University in New York State. The latter is where she did a dissertation on the theology of Bonaventure and really dive deep into the Franciscan historical tradition. She's the author of more than 20 books, in the first several of which focused on the theology of Bonaventure, Franciscan prayer and spirituality, Franciscan vision of creation, and it was focused almost exclusively on sort of situating the medieval tradition and pulling insights from that. However, over the last decade, Delio has been more and more inspired not only by her Franciscan roots in the Franciscan tradition, but the insights of Teilhard de Chardin, the Jesuit paleontologist, and a real advocate, early advocate for conversations between science and religion, particularly as they pertain to theories of evolution. Her latest work has been focused again on science and religion, and she has emphasized evolution, taking it, to the next level, not in an arbitrary way, but thinking about the human person and humanity's place within God's creation in light of technological revolutions, scientific revolutions, discoveries about human personhood, mind and thought, rationality, matter, spirit, etc. She's interested in questions related to what impact these discoveries, these revelations of science and technology have on our theological understanding of personhood and of creation, and what may need to be revised in light of that. And this is where we get this phrase posthumanism. I think that the term posthumanism can sound quite scary to folks, because it sounds like something from a sci-fi novel or film, and there's some truth to that. It can be scary, but Ilia Delio wants to make this point that if we take the truth of historical evolution seriously, then there is always a sense, we may not identify it as progress in the moment, but there is a trajectory, there is evolution, there is dynamism in the world, in human experience, in creation, right? So she takes for granted the existence of God, God's loving creation of the world, the insights of people like Bonaventure and Scotus and Francis and Clare of Assisi, but she also wants to take seriously, much like in the 13th century, how Thomas Aquinas famously engaged, much to his, detriment makes it sound so serious, but he engaged rediscovered Aristotelian thought that was called pagan and was considered non-theological, non-scriptural, and it got him into what we would call academic or ecclesiastical trouble. Similarly, but because it was so cutting edge, as it were, it was a new way of thinking, it was new philosophy. Well, in light of new science, Delio, who is both a scientist and a theologian, wants to take these things both incredibly seriously. So she has worked in the areas of transhumanism and posthumanism. Transhumanism basically means the kind of way in which human experience is supplemented through technology and other factors in an effort for human development, ongoing development, and betterment. So transhumanism is about improving the experience of biological life as human persons and maybe extending it in some direction, in some capacity, not just temporarily, not just longer life, but the quality and experience of life itself, taking science and technology as an integral part of that seriously. Posthumanism is a more recent area of thought, and something that Delio is really working on and is spending quite a bit of time with these days. It seeks deeper relationality, as she puts it, and regards the person as a complex entity of embodied mind embedded in the matrix of cultural information. So it's not merely about kind of accessorizing or expanding the straightforward experience of human personhood or existence. It's about recognizing a more substantive change, one that's directed not just toward betterment in some strictly, species-based sense, but striving more to deeper relationality, a kind of holism, as she'll often say, an integrated whole. So the concept of posthumanism really signals, from Delio's perspective, again, grounded in the Franciscan tradition, and as a Franciscan sister, this is the lens through which she's viewing the science and the emergent theology. It signals a potential trajectory for evolutionary history, in which, like our pre-Homo sapiens ancestors, right, so we're the species Homo sapiens, who have evolved from earlier hominoids and of the larger kind of primate family within creation, are we witnessing now or anticipating new or renewed creation with the human person as such, right? So the human person, and this is very Teilhardian in this regard. Teilhard famously describes the human as sort of the head of an arrow, the kind of, or the spear point or the tip of an arrow, and that there's a trajectory of evolution, and that there are other creatures that are evolving as well behind us, but we're kind of paving the way, leading the way. So, scholars note that this is a form of potentially deeper connectivity. Is that the next step, as it were? Is that where we're going? Whether through technological incorporation into previously limited organic experience or in some other capacity yet to be fully realized. So is there potential here for connectivity, for relationship, for a holistic sense of the cosmos? And if so, which is something Delio is arguing in her very recent work, then she brings a distinctively Franciscan perspective to this ongoing scholarly discussion by scientists and philosophers and other academics. This idea that relationality is at the heart of what we're called to be as human. Remember that from Francis of Assisi's own understanding of Christian discipleship, what God's message to us is all about in terms of how we live. It's to prioritize relationship. And if that's true, and this is the trajectory or a trajectory in which our experience of the world and ourselves as creatures is moving, then what role does God play in this? What role does the Spirit play in this? What role does science and technology play with what we have previously understood about our corporeal existence? Just a couple examples of some of her reflection on this. She says early in her recent book, Re-Enchanting the Earth, "My work builds on the insights of posthumanism, but widens this perspective through cosmic and relational holism, building on Teilhard, that's Teilhard de Chardin, his ideas for a new religion of the earth. If religion means connecting to ultimate wholeness, and AI, that is artificial intelligence, or a new kind of inorganic intelligence, we might say, or more than organic intelligence, is seeking, if this is on a trajectory to seek hyperconnection towards seamless unity, then, she argues, religion is at the heart of AI. These are not antithetical. Furthermore, she argues, and this appears later in the book, that the post-human, what is being proposed, if only as a placeholder for what is emerging, if the post-human is brought to birth by creatively crossing boundaries, linking chips and brains, electronically embedded in an ongoing process of hyper-personalization that resists the technical will to disembodiment and immateriality. The human person acquires a new bios techne, this Greek combo here of a neologism, a new kind of consciousness that is both about technology and both about organic biology united together, giving rise, she argues, to a new type of world, from tribal national awareness to global consciousness, from divergence to convergence. So this idea of monadology, this kind of siloism, this sort of self-referential, solipsistic experience of the world, which is on a species level deeply anthropocentric, on a human level it becomes very individualistic. If what the direction of creation and evolution and science is revealing is that we're moving toward greater consciousness, greater relationality, greater holism, kind of a holistic view of the cosmos, which is, going back to Bonaventure, part of what Bonaventure also understood God's vision for creation was, right? Interrelatedness, mutuality, harmony within creation. If so, then Ilia Delio is saying, well, then this isn't necessarily something to be afraid of or run away from, right? This may be the natural progression. So that's about it for today. Just little tastes, just little samples. These are just a few examples of how the Franciscan Global Vision of creation continues to develop in our own time. And there are many other ways. It's also becoming increasingly more global, with Franciscans on all habitable continents, contributing not only to the study and advancement of the tradition, but especially through praxis and witness. And so we see this in the Anthropocene, this era that we live in where global climate change that is generated by human malfeasance, as it were, is eliciting in people of goodwill, especially Franciscan women and men, a certain response that's about conversion, what Pope Francis calls ecological conversion, but also about dialogue, action, and engagement. So it's been my absolute pleasure to be with you this week. I hope that as brief as these lectures have been, as short as perhaps the reading material has been, and maybe as limited as our conversations have been, given the brevity of a one-week program, that you walk away with an opportunity to reflect more deeply, to consider not only the resources of our Franciscan tradition, not only the insights of Pope Francis and the Church's teaching in Laudato Si, but how do we move beyond that, recognizing this important magisterial text as the beginning and not the end of our reflection, engagement, in action, in acting of this Franciscan global vision of creation in the world.